You know, it was great to have an opportunity to get energized and really get focused, because this workshop, this plenary session is of critical importance to us all. We're about to talk about voting rights. And for those of you who are familiar with the fight around voting rights, the security of our ability to vote for the person of our choice, that is the right upon which all of our other rights are protected.
Yeah.
So this is as critical and key to our work as anything else we can talk about. So ladies and gentlemen, let me first begin by introducing myself. My name is Kevin Miles. I'm joining you from the sunny and wonderful Atlanta, Georgia this morning.
Woo! Yes.
I am now newly the National Director for Field Operations for the Eastern Division.
Okay.
And it is my honor and my privilege to bring before you this morning, to actually get this panel kicked off and get it started, our senior advisor to the president and CEO of the NAACP, and also our director of our voting rights program, Miss Joteka Edie, who I know as Joey. So
All
Joey,
right.
if you will come up here and join us and get us started. Ladies and gentlemen, give her a round of applause as she comes forward.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I know we're all feeling really, really good. So first of all, you're going to see all of our Twitter handles, but this conversation is going to be live tweeted. So I know many of you may have heard the song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised."
That's right.
But I believe the revolution will be tweeted, Facebooked, and Instagram. So we hope that you will be a part of the revolution this morning. We encourage you to live tweet utilizing the hashtag L500 in addition to the hashtag voting rights. So this morning, I want to talk a bit and just really set a context, and then I'm going to introduce you to an amazing set of panelists that we have before us this morning. So as we get the PowerPoint going. Now, how many of you have experienced some type of, or know anything about the attack on voting rights in our country right now? Raise your hand. No, how about clap your hands? Clap your hands. Clap your hands. So we know right now that our nation is still in the midst of one of the most aggressive attacks on voting rights that we have seen in more than a century. One of the most aggressive attacks on voting rights. Simply put, we are experiencing a dismantling of democracy in America. Now, one thing that's important to know about this act, about what's happening, is that this effort is unprecedented. It's very targeted, and it's also very well funded. There has been an estimated $1 billion put into ensuring and trying to attack the voting rights of a massive amount of Americans in our country. Now, if you've ever heard me talk about voting rights, I like to get the audience involved, because I think it's important for us to understand what's really happening. I want you to look at your neighbor. I want you to say, neighbor. Neighbor. Come on, we can do better than this morning. Say, neighbor.
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 What's happening?
What's happening
Is an attempt
is an attempt
to shift
power.
power. Neighbor.
Neighbor.
What's happening?
What's happening
Is an attempt
to
shift
shift
power.
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 Power. That is ultimately what this fight is about. It is about power. It is about who controls power. It is about how that power is used, and it is about what that power yields.
Say so.
That is so important for us to know and understand, that ultimately the fight for voting rights in our country is about power. Now, we have seen since 2011 more than 250 voter suppression bills introduced in at least 41 states across the nation. Now, we firmly believe that this is as a result of two things. Now, some people may say it was because President Obama was elected into office. Well, he's one part of the equation, but he is not the entire equation. What really happened is in 2010, the census numbers projected that we were quickly becoming a more brown and black America. And as a result of that, we saw what was possible in the 2008 election. Now, what we saw was a massive voter turnout of African American women, young people, which is one of the largest growing demographics of diversity in our nation. And we saw the combination of that with white progressive voters. And what we saw was the election of President Obama. So it's not just about President Obama, because if it was about President Obama only, we would have saw all the voter suppression stop after the 2012 election. But what we're seeing now isn't an increase. Now, very quickly, we just want to set this up this morning that the attack on voting rights, you hear about photo ID, but it's not just photo ID. It's also cuts to early voting. There's this thing called proof of citizenship, which is very, very dangerous. This proof of citizenship, show me your papers. It sounds like it's really about ensuring that people are voting who actually are citizens in the U.S. But when you actually look at the details of what's actually in those laws and what's being proposed is that when someone registers to vote, that they have to attach a copy of their proof of citizenship, their birth certificate, or whatever documentation, naturalization papers. Now, when you ask yourself, when you put the common sense factor in it, how many people actually, when they go to register to vote, if they're at their local grocery store, who actually has a Xerox machine with them? And who's carrying around those papers? Think about it. So these laws and these proposals that are being proposed, they say one thing, but it actually means another. One other big part of the attack on voting rights is felony disenfranchisement. We can never, ever forget, particularly as people of color, that there are more than 4.4 million Americans that have served their time, that have paid their debt to society, that cannot vote because of felony convictions. And so we have to continue to focus on that work. There are voter purges, restrictions on voter registration. There are the removal of polling places, and our panelists will talk more about this later today. And we're also seeing the influx of money in politics. And so you may say, well, what does that have to do with voting rights? But as we see more and more of the richest and most wealthiest people in our country influx the elections, what ends up happening is it drowns out the voices of everyday folks that are people in this room. And so we have to be very careful to dismiss money in politics as a part of a separate movement that's not connected to the broader fight against voting rights. Now, one of the biggest attacks on voting rights that we saw in 2013 was Shelby County versus Holder. And we're going to hear a lot about Shelby County versus Holder, but in short, it removed the pre-clearance process. Essentially, it froze the pre-clearance process because we still have it, and our great experts will talk about that this morning. And it also unleashed widespread voter suppression. Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina. We could go on and on and on with all of the voter suppression and all of the tactics that are now happening across the country as a result of what happened with Shelby County versus Holder. So you heard about what's happening in our nation. Now let's talk a bit about what we should be doing. Number one, we've got to expand the electorate. Look at your neighbor, say, expand the electorate.
Expand the electorate.
We've got to make sure that we are registering people to vote no matter what the laws are, within the confines of the law, of course, but we've got to make sure that we are registering people to vote and we're turning them out. We've got to shift the narrative. Say, shift the narrative.
Shift the narrative.
Come on, we can do better. We've got to shift the narrative.
Shift the narrative.
We have to tell this story from our voice. When voter suppression is happening, when a polling place is moved, we have to tell that story. We cannot allow the mass echo chambers of other networks that are meant to put confusion, lies out there to confuse us, control the airwaves. We have to tell the story, and we have to tell it from every single medium, from the pulpits, on the radio. We even have to go to the clubs. We need to go everywhere there is somebody whose vote is under attack. And there is no place in America where that place exists. So we need to be everywhere. And finally, we have to do the work to get our rights back and extend and expand the rights that we never had. Now, our strategy in action. One, we got to make the conflict visible. Now, I've said this to you before. I'm from South Carolina, and every summer my granddaddy cuts that grass because he says you got to see the snakes in the grass. So we've got to make sure that we are exposing all of the voter suppression snakes that are out there. We have to make it very clear and evident and make the conflict visible. We have to win and defend in 2014 and 2015. We've got to be in every state house capital. We've got to be on Capitol Hill, and we need to be in the courtrooms. We have to be everywhere defending and winning in 2014 and 2015. We've got to do the work to educate voters and turn them out. We've got to change the game too. We've got to make sure that we're playing offense more than we're playing defense. That is a posture that we have to get ourselves out of the posture of playing offense more than defense. Now, we have a lot of power. And ultimately, it is known that we have this power because there's such an investment spent to try to dwindle that power. So we have to put together our capacity across the country, combine it with our advocacy, and move it into civic engagement power. Finally, we've got to expand the movement for democracy in America. We've got to strengthen this national meta-narrative for democracy. We've got to support state campaigns and movements. Again, play offense more than defense. And we've got to be fighting for voting rights expansion. We can't just be playing defense. We've got to look at how do we expand early voting? How do we expand same-day registration? How do we modernize voting rights across the country? And most importantly, we need to ask ourselves and fight and have a North Star. Why is it that we have to do voter registration every single year? Voter registration should be automatic. How can we have democracies like other countries, places like South Africa, where you never lose your right to vote? Even if you go to prison, the right to vote is upheld. And finally, we've got to ensure that we're fixing the Voting Rights Act, and you're going to hear a lot about that today, and we have to organize, organize, organize. Ladies and gentlemen, it is never a question of if we will win, but it is always and will always continue to be a question of when we will win on this fight. So I am so happy to have joining us today this amazing panel that is going to respond to what you just heard and really also tell us a bit more about this issue, talk a bit about how it's connected to the midterm elections and what you can be doing in your communities to help us ensure that it's so much at stake, but there's a lot that we can do. Now, again, this conversation is going to be live tweeted. So we encourage you to live tweet this conversation. Utilize hashtag L500 and also hashtag voting rights. You'll see it up here on the screen. Also, we will keep flashing back the Twitter handles of all of our panelists this morning. So I want to now introduce us to our illustrious and wonderful panel this morning. Can we give our panelists a hand who've joined us from all across the country? So first we have joining us to my immediate left is Mr. Albert Sanders. Albert Sanders is the counsel on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. He's the principal legal and policy advisor to Assistant Majority Leader Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who chairs the subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights. Mr. Sanders covers voting rights and a number of issues for the United States Senate. Next, we have Ms. Keisha Gaskins. Ms. Keisha Gaskins is the program director for the Democratic Practice for the United States program with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Keisha is a longtime advocate, having worked as an organizer, a lobbyist, a trial attorney. And prior to joining Rockefeller Brothers, she was a senior counsel with the Brennan Center for Justice, serving as the director of redistricting and representation program. Next, we have Mr. Duell Ross. Mr. Duell Ross joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as a Frank Fellow, working with both the political participation and education practice groups. Duell completed 2 years at a law firm working on complex commercial and civil rights litigation. He also previously served as a law clerk for the Honorable Roger L. Gregory on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Francis Johnson, who has combined a passion for helping people through law, education, and faith. Francis is called to serve at his present age. He's a state president of the Georgia NAACP, having been elected in October 2013 as the youngest person to hold that office. So let's give our wonderful panel a round of applause this morning. So I want to start off with Keisha. Keisha, so you saw the presentation this morning. You've lived this presentation. We know that so much is at stake as it relates to voting rights, democracy in our country. Essentially, democracy is dismantling.
Right.
But there's actually been movement over the last 10 years that's gone in both directions. We've seen it swing both ways. Could you just elaborate on what the state of play has been as it relates to voting rights, both proactively reforms as well as the attacks on voting rights?
Sure. I think one of the things we're all acutely aware of are a lot of the attacks on voting, and Joteka, you outlined them beautifully. And so certainly we are very concerned following Shelby County, the loss of Section 5 protection, not just around suppression issues in and of themselves, but representation challenges and things around the country. The flip side of that coin is that we have seen advancements. We have seen improvements and opportunities to vote. First, with all the work done by LDF and some of our other partners, really doing pushback. We've seen really good results with the laws in Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all being declared unconstitutional, the voter ID laws. And those laws are not going to be able to stop people from voting, but we still have a lot of challenges on the ground. We've seen a lot of affirmative work around online voter registration. That is one thing that's really been a bipartisan reform. We've seen it in states all over the country, and the opportunity to have easier and faster access to voter registration, which then allows organizations doing voter registration easier access to the polls. We've seen expansion of early voting in certain places, and expansion of same-day voter registration. We're on the heels of that in Delaware, passed in Hawaii, and some other places where same-day voter registration is an incredibly important measure. Unlike a lot of other voter measures that may have some questions about the efficacy about a positive reform, same-day voter registration is shown to absolutely unequivocally increase turnout, particularly in communities of color. No question. So as we think about affirmative reforms, we absolutely have to think about expansion around same-day voter registration and access to the polls around voter registration, third-party voter registration, whether it's community voter registration drives, other opportunities, because that's another area where we see almost immediate response and expansion to the rolls, expansion to the polls. And so all these efforts are really coordinated, and I think, Joteka, your point is really important. Voter registration actually should not be this complicated. If they can find me to pay my taxes, I should be able to find me to be registered to vote. This is not that complicated an issue. And the fact is, it should be mobile, right? There are voter registration modernization criteria objectives, and one of them is mobility of registration, that no matter where you go in your state, whether you're moving someplace else, across the street, that your voter registration should move with you. And these should be a part of the affirmative reforms that we're talking about today. And so there's a lot of other measures. I don't want to consume too much time, but what the primary issue I want to focus is also on, I'm sorry, one more piece I almost forgot, young people, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, incredibly important. That way when people turn 18, they're automatically registered to vote. And again, it's very much a part of institutionalized voting, making part of the process, not making it harder. We should not be a country that makes it harder to vote. The access to the polls and accessing your rights and being able to engage in this process is incredibly important. So as we think about a voter registration modernization agenda, as we think about expanding rights and making elections a lot easier, that has to be our primary objective.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Keisha. Now, Keisha mentioned Shelby County versus Holder. And sometimes, and I do have to say this, I said this in our pre-call, this is a panel of all lawyers. So, but they have promised that they're not going to use all this legal lingo today. But these are really amazing. I think it really shows that you can have people-centered lawyers. And all of our panelists are people-centered lawyers, and they do the work of the people every single day. So I think it is really important to note that there are people that are litigating this work with the people at the forefronts of the agenda. And that goes to you, Duell, because the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is a separate organization of the NAACP and a wonderful partner of the NAACP, has been really a strong advocate around the litigation efforts and really actually argued the Shelby County versus Holder case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 2000, which we got a decision in June of 2013. Could you explain a bit for those that are listening, and there are people all across the country that are watching us, a bit what happened in Shelby County versus Holder? What is Shelby County versus Holder, and what is the impact of Shelby County versus Holder?
Sure. So Shelby County was a Supreme Court decision, as Joe mentioned, from June 2013, in which the Supreme Court said that the coverage formula of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. So I don't know how much all of you all know about the Voting Rights Act's prior iteration, but there were particular states in the South, mostly Georgia, Alabama, all the states that you would think of the former Confederacy, as well as parts of New York, California, and Michigan, that any time they made any change to voting, when they changed a polling place, when they enacted a voter ID law, from things big to small, had to ask the federal government first whether or not they could do that change. And the government would decide, or a court would decide, whether or not that change would have a disparate impact on African Americans and other minorities, or whether or not it was purposely enacted to disenfranchise minorities. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decided that the formula decided which states were covered and which parts of states were covered was unconstitutional because it was based on older data. I think Mr. Sanders is going to talk later about the effort to replace that coverage formula, but I've heard it described as having your car. So we have the Voting Rights Act out there to use, but we no longer have the keys to the car. So that's where we stand now. And you've seen just in the last year a lot of states responding to that, formerly covered states reenacting laws that courts or the government had already said they could not enact. So I think the most prominent example of that, and a case that LDF is now litigating, is Texas v. Holder, or excuse me, United States v. Texas, in which Texas had a voter ID law. A court in Washington, D.C. said that voter ID law would disenfranchise disproportionate numbers of African Americans and Latino voters. And Texas was not allowed to implement that law for the 2012 elections. Unfortunately, as soon as the Supreme Court issued this decision, the exact same day, the Attorney General and the Governor of Texas said that they were going to go ahead and implement this ID law. And so immediately, LDF and others filed a lawsuit, suit that's going on right now. And we're going to hopefully have a decision sometime in the next couple of months after it goes to trial. But these are the kinds of things that we're seeing in terms of states responding. We have places like Georgia where they tried to pass an early voting law, where there were other sort of local decisions like polling place changes, which LDF and the local NAACP has worked on. So I think it's important to keep in mind that these issues are not just issues like voter ID laws, which sort of everyone knows about, but very small issues, like in Lee County, Alabama, there's a polling place where they're going to move it from an African-American neighborhood to several miles out. And that's something that the Voting Rights Act used to stop. And now we have to depend on all of you. The NAACP, I think, has a website where you can report information about voting changes in your area. And LDF also pass out all the information to you that was on your chairs, where you can report to us any voting changes in your neighborhood. So,
thank you so much. So, so I think it's clear. We've heard that Shelby County, not good. But one thing that's important in the Shelby County decision is that the Supreme Court clearly said that discrimination in voting does exist. Yes. It also stated in its opinion that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the pre-clearance, the section that allows for pre-clearance, which allows for the Department of Justice or three-court judge panel to stop a law from going into place before it goes into effect, is perfectly legal. But when Section 4 was...
Right.
Could you talk a bit more about
I'll talk a little bit more about,
that?
so I think, as I said, so the coverage formula just was what decided which states were covered. Mm-hmm. Section 5 is a different section of the Voting Rights Act, which says, which has sort of that pre-clearance process. If you change a law, you have to ask the federal government or a court in Washington, D.C. first whether you can enact that change. What the Supreme Court did was it struck down just the coverage formula. So the Voting Rights Act still exists. Parts of the Voting Rights Act still exist, which say, you can't pass a discriminatory law. So that's what LDF right now is suing under in Texas. Other parts of the Voting Rights Act also still exist. So like I said, the car of the Voting Rights Act still exists. This pre-clearance process has not yet been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But the coverage formula that says which states actually have to abide by this process no longer exists, unfortunately. So.
Thank you. So that takes us to another part of this decision in which we at the NAACP and I think all of our partners, and I think most people here, that the Supreme Court clearly said that Congress has an authority and I think also an obligation to fix the Voting Rights Act. And so this takes me to Mr. Sanders. Albert, if you could really just take us through, we know that now there's legislation pending in Congress called the VRAA, which is the Voting Rights Amendment Act, which is a proposed fix to what happened with Shelby County versus Holder. But Albert, could you just walk us through what is the VRAA, what's in it, what's not in it, and really tell us a bit more about what we as people who vote, what should we be doing? Like how can we influence our members of Congress, what works, what doesn't work, in order to move this legislation forward?
Thanks, Oteka. So the Voting Rights Amendments Act is before Congress now. It's a bipartisan bill in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate, we're still looking for a Republican co-sponsor to join us. What is the key purpose of the Voting Rights Amendments Act? Well, there are three things that it does that are incredibly important to restoring the coverage formula and answering the call that the Supreme Court gave to Congress in order to revive the Voting Rights Act. Number one, what it would do is it would subject jurisdictions to that pre-clearance process if over the course of 15 years they had 5 violations of the Voting Rights Act or discriminated in a way that was determined by a court or through another process. So as a result of that, if a jurisdiction had those violations over a course of 15 years, then for a 10-year period, they'd be subject to the pre-clearance process through the Voting Rights Act. There's also a provision in the Voting Rights Act that allows courts to immediately bail in a jurisdiction, whether it's a full state or a county or a city or a smaller district, into the provisions of the Voting Rights Act if the court finds that that jurisdiction acted in a particularly egregious way. Now, what the Voting Rights Act would do is the Voting Rights Amendment Act, what it would do is it would expand that authority. How? Currently, courts already have that authority if the jurisdiction intentionally discriminated. Well, how do you determine if a jurisdiction was intentionally discriminating? Well, generally you have to go through maybe the legislative record, some of the debates at the State House, and maybe there'll be some politician that was, shall we say, inartful enough to say, hey, if we pass this bill, it'll stop all the black people from voting. Let's pass it, right? It's 2014. A lot of times that's not happening anymore. It does still happen, ironically, and there are some examples. It does still happen, but it doesn't happen that often. More so now, what we're seeing are circumstances where people are reviewing the data, quietly looking at voting trends and patterns across the country, looking at what populations vote on Sunday before Election Day, looking at what populations are more likely to register to vote through a voting registration drive as opposed to driving down to the city and registering there. So they look at a lot of these numbers and they say, well, listen, we're going to pass a law that saves us money by ending voting on the Sunday before election, or that protects the integrity of the vote by shutting down voter registration by outside organizations like the NAACP. So what this second provision of the Voting Rights Amendment Act would do is it would allow a court to immediately bail in or cause a jurisdiction to pre-clear their voting laws if the court finds that they're discriminatory in their effect, in terms of the effect that they have on a population of people, not just that they were passed with the intent of discriminating, if you understand that distinction there. And another thing it would do is something that's really important for all of our good advocacy groups, like the NAACP, like the Brennan Center, like the Leadership Conference, like the Lawyers Committee, like Project Vote and the Advancement Project, all those folks that are out there spending literally millions of dollars and many more hours on litigation trying to push back against this well-funded voting rights attack that Joteka talked about, they need information. A lot of times, as Duell just noted, a lot of times states will pass a law or a county will pass a law that says, hey, yeah, we're going to just move this polling place down the street. No big deal. Don't think about it. We're just going to do it. And nobody finds out about it. Well, once you start digging, you realize, wait a minute, here, this polling place before was in a predominantly Latino district. So folks could walk over there and they could vote. Now the same population is going to have to get on a bus or take the metro or get a ride and go all the way across town in order to vote. Do you think that's going to have the effect of stopping some people from voting? Absolutely. So in those circumstances, what the VRAA would do is include a number of reporting requirements so that if a jurisdiction changes the law, for example, within 48 hours, they have to go on the internet. They have to post, here's the law that we changed, and here are the implications of it. It will impact X number of people from such and such demographic group in X, Y, and Z geographic location. So listen, this is a very important, it is a critical piece of legislation that's got to be passed. But the only way that gets done is if the public is clamoring for it. What do you mean by clamoring? How do we get the Voting Rights Act in the first place? People marched, people bled, people died. They called on Congress. They didn't just sit down and play video games and talk about it and complain among themselves on Sunday morning. They got up, they got out, and they got it done, right? And so that's what we need to do now, because the voting rights fights that we had in the past, they're not over. They are reemerging in a very sophisticated and subtle way. So what can you do to answer the second part of your question, Joteka? What can you do right now? I got a few things you can do.
Friday.
One thing you can do right away is all of you all are organizers, all of you all are connected. You've got incredible numbers of followers on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and you got people's phone numbers and email addresses and all that. Talk to them. Talk to them about this issue, particularly young people. Talk to your friends, talk to your family members about this issue, and tell them they need to call their member of Congress and tell them to fix the Voting Rights Act. Call their senator. Tell them that they need to support the Voting Rights Act and that they need to support the bill that would amend the Voting Rights Act. You can call DC, that's effective, but it's even more effective if you get 3 or 4 or 5 or 500 of your friends to go to your congressperson's office in their district, or go to your senator's office in their district, in the state, because guess what? They're more likely to listen to you there. Because they say, wait a minute, these are people from my district, they vote, they're concerned, they're engaged, and they're here demanding action on this voting rights bill. There are a number of other ways, I don't want to go on and on, but that's one piece that all of you all can commit to do as you leave here. One other, you can go and you can go in your state and you can learn how to be a poll monitor. Be a volunteer at the polls so that you understand those laws, you understand how they impact people, and so you can help folks vote effectively instead of being part of the process that sort of turns people away. So look forward to the conversation. Thank all of you for having me. And
well, thank you so much. I'm just so happy we have Albert Sanders in the U.S. Senate, aren't we? So Albert really, yes, let's give Albert a hand. Yes. It's good to know we have brothers like Albert in the U.S. Senate. So now Albert, you know, he really laid it out for us. And he said that your member of Congress needs to hear from you. He talked about what we need to be doing. Now, Dr. Francis Johnson, you lead the Georgia State Conference of the NAACP. And the NAACP has an amazing field presence across the entire country in every single state. There's some state conference presidents that are in here. I see Ms. Hazel Dukes, the New York State Conference president. I think Ms. Adora Obianwezi is here. I see Mr. Gerald Stansbury here from Maryland. I think there are a number that are here. But you represent, in many ways, the front line. So we heard a bit about what's happening, the context, what we need to do. Can you talk a bit more? We know that the midterm elections are upon us. Shelby County versus Holder has created a very difficult situation for us. And we know that there's legislation in Congress that needs to be moved that could attempt to begin to fix what happened in Shelby County versus Holder. From your vantage point as a leader fighting a good fight in a place like Georgia, what should we be doing? What's happening in Georgia, and what should the grassroots community be doing, not only to move this conversation and this bill forward that Albert spoke of in Congress, but what should we be doing to prepare ourselves for the 2014 elections?
I think the first thing we need to, and thank you for the question, first thing we need to understand is that that this is something that has not come up out of nowhere. That freedom is a constant struggle. That from the very origins of our country, there were a group of people who believed that this should be an oligarchy, and there were a group of people who thought we should move towards democracy. There are a group of people who wrote in the Federalist Papers that some folks didn't deserve the right to search for the common good. That Africans, that women, that indigenous people, you didn't possess the intellectual capital to really search for the common good. That's in the Federalist documents that argued for the creation of this country, codified in the Constitution of the United States. And so it has been through persistent and effective work, organizations like the NAACP and others, that have advanced this country towards democracy, but we are not there yet. So I think framing the discussion from that historical standpoint, that this is a journey, is the first thing. And then secondly, I think acknowledging what's at stake in these midterm elections. If the Democrats lose control of the United States Senate, Barack Obama will be impeached. I'll say that. When you look from a historical standpoint, that is what is at stake. It is about undoing the legacy of the franchise that put Barack Obama in office in 2008 and put him back in the office in 2012. He lost North Carolina on election day. He lost Florida on election day. He won them in early voting, and that's why we see direct attacks against those things. They are bent on undoing the legacy of ordinary people electing someone who was not chosen. That's what we have to realize. When I see what's going on in Georgia, it is not veiled, it is not insidious, it is not hidden at all. The agenda is on Front Street. And when you think about the power dynamics of it, then it's clear. Challenges that were ruled by the Justice Department as not meeting pre-clearance have been rushed in the wake of Shelby, were put back on the agenda. Let me tell you some of the things that Salon doesn't report, New York Times doesn't report, even the AJC doesn't report. These are new strategies. One strategy, and it's amazing you think of it from a historical standpoint. At one point, we had to fight to get into primaries in the South, fight to get candidates as a part of Democratic primaries. The new tactic is to eliminate primaries altogether, to turn primary fights into general election fights. So to declare all municipal government positions that have traditionally been partisan positions nonpartisan, having them elected at the primary level where voting turnout is low. Alvy Coles, who's here with us today, ran for clerk of Bullock County, clerk of courts there in Bullock County. Alvy Coles ran an outstanding campaign. Turnout in the primary was 11%. So if you move positions that were partisan to nonpartisan and have them basically elected at the primary, that those who show up are those whose voices will be heard. The second challenge is consolidation of government. Georgia has 159 counties. The reason why Georgia has 159 counties is because they wanted to make the county unit so weak. The General Assembly only meets for 40 days of the year. They wanted to make the state government so weak it couldn't enforce the laws to protect black folks in the state. So now there's again a strange twist of history to consolidate governments, make government bigger, representing more people, and thereby moving the person who's elected further from those who have elected them. And so in cities all across the state where African Americans are now the majority and there is a new minority that is white, generally speaking, there's a rush to consolidate government, to absorb more space, to further dilute the new majority. And we see that in Columbus, we see that in Macon, we see that in Augusta, we see that. And another thing that we see is a dividing of places where you can't necessarily consolidate government, like Atlanta. Atlanta was traditionally represented by John Lewis in Congress. Atlanta now is represented by 5 congressmen. They have divided Atlanta into 5 pieces like a pie. So we see gerrymandering of that order. Finally, we see just outrageous things. For example, in Athens. Athens, there's a proposal on the table to reduce the number of polling places in Athens, a sizable population over 100,000 people, to eliminate all the polling places and consolidate them into one. This was under the guise that it would save money. And that polling place just happened to be the Athens Clarke County Police Department.
Say that again.
Those are the sorts of things that we're seeing all around in this fight. And let me tell you why you make a difference. The Georgia NAACP, and I'm so glad that Mother Dukes is here, President Noeasy is here, they know the fight. This legislative session was talked about to be just about the budget. Everything but the budget came up, including a rollback to early voting. There are folks who should be on our side who are not in this fight, who put legislation forward to roll it back from 45 to 21 days. And the proposal at this legislative session was to roll it from 21 to 6 days. The idea was that cities needed to save money. So at the same time that we're creating new cities in Atlanta to dilute Fulton County's strength, to dilute the new majority, there's this argument, cross argument, that it costs too much for democracy. It costs $1 million a week to keep a soldier in Afghanistan. And the government was saying that they would save $3,400 on average by eliminating those polling. If we can pay $1 million to keep a soldier across the world standing for democracy, we can afford $3,400 to have democracy here at home. Here's what happened. You got to show up in committee meetings. We got the call. First of all, these committee meetings aren't published. The calendar isn't announced. Within a 6-hour notice, we got notice that this was coming up in the House. We had to be able to be mobilized. So when you go back home to your units, when you get a call to get down to the Capitol to take part in the committee meeting, you have got to understand where priorities lie and get down. We got down to the committee meeting and they were not going to let us speak at all. And we had the data. We had the analysis. We would continue to fight. We packed the committee meetings out. We stood up, we stopped the committee process, and we said, wait a minute, you can't roll back early voting from 21 to 6 days because we know who that will impact. We rallied and got unusual allies. We had to talk with folks from the Tea Party who we had to make them choke on their words. If you believe in democracy, then why are you making voting harder? We had to make them eat the lexicon that they preach. And we had to put them into what William Barber says is we had to put them into a alphabetical jiu-jitsu. We had to make them turn themselves upside down. But it worked, and we were able to stop in this session early voting from going from 21 to 6 days. But do not think that that will not come up again in the next session.
And again.
So what we have to do is have an offense. Right now, our NAACP, every state conference needs to have a full-time lobbyist down at that level. We cannot just allow volunteers to do this because they are running the game all the time. So go back to your state conferences, plug into your local units, get engaged because the fight is right now.
Thank you so much. So, yes, thank you. So you raised a good point, Dr. Johnson, in that we actually have to show up. Mm-hmm. We actually have to be present. I think one thing, and Albert, you raised that point as well, that we could call our members of Congress, but showing up, being there, being present actually matters. Now, we know that the 2014 elections is upon us, and I just want to throw this out for any of our panelists. If you could just elaborate, it's so much at stake. So we know that there's this massive attack on voting rights, but also there's an attack on women's rights, there's an attack on workers' rights, there's an all-out assault on progressive values in our country. I think there's a real struggle to redefine the moral center of our nation. In the 2014 election, I think there's a lot at stake. You know, some would say, a lot of political pundits would say that the U.S. Senate is at stake.
It really is.
And so there's a lot at stake. And so there's concern. There was just recently an article in the New York Times that suggested that black voter turnout may drop significantly in the 2014 election.
Right.
So could each of you, or just one or two of you, expound on what does that mean? How do we overcome that? And what do we need to do right now to ensure that that voter turnout does not drop?
I think one of the things that's a real visual example of what could happen in 2014 is what did happen in 2010.
That's right.
The 2010 low voter turnout, particularly amongst communities of color, African Americans in particular, young people as well, really set the stage for massive legislative changes at the state legislative level. There were, I believe, somewhere north of 600 new state legislators on the Republican side, and not to be overly partisan about it, but the fact is these were the legislatures that were passing the restrictive laws. Brand new after the 2010 election, and many new Republican governors that came out after 2010. It was those new 2010 legislatures that passed the vast majority of these restrictive laws that we are spending millions of dollars in resources now defending rather than having an affirmative voting agenda. Right? We are spending millions holding a line based on laws that were passed in response to a low voter turnout year. So there's a whole, it isn't just, oh, this doesn't happen and then there's a congressional piece. All of these strategies line up together. The 2014 election holds even more at stake than what's incredibly important, which is the U.S. Senate. But the state legislatures are incredibly important. This is the ground game where these laws are passed. This is a ground game that makes a decision and choices, not just about what laws are passed and where they go, but who's in the pipeline to get elected tomorrow.
That's right.
Right? And these are state elections, these are school board elections, these are county elections. All of these county and local elections that are happening 2013, 2014, 2015 are the ones that are going to make a difference for tomorrow, that make a difference in your day-to-day lives, that make people stand up and say, this is what I care about my life, my children, where they go to school, how many teachers in the classroom, how the police behave on the street, how many police on the street. These are these elections. These are these local elections that happened in 2014, and we cannot allow 2010 to happen again. 2010, we saw the rollback that happened after 2010. If this is the baseline in 2014,
Wow.
the rollback, we can't have it. Like, I can't even contemplate it. Like, it's just not,
yeah.
like, we
Right.
cannot see, I mean, this is Jim Crow. Right? I don't think I'm exaggerating, right? During the Jim Crow period in 1865 to 1965, there were 400 laws passed that affect around race, right? Arguably around 50 to 60 of them directly impacted voting and voting registration. Did you see the number Joe Taka put up there? For just the last 3 years, it was 240.
Yes.
This is not just a happenstance. The 2014 elections can lay the opportunity for the ground game that makes a difference in the amount of power that African American communities are going to have in what defines our country's policies around not just voting, but around rights, around working, around minimum wage, around all these policies, ban the box legislation, make so people don't have to say whether or not they have a criminal conviction as they apply for a job, get in the pipeline, stay in the pipeline, have an equal opportunity at a chance for a decent job to pay your bills. All of this comes out of the 2014 elections, and we have got to turn out. Is that? Okay.
No, that's good. Yes. Give her a hand, everybody. Come on, we can get the energy up in here.
Absolutely.
She's bringing it. This is Jim Crow.
It is Jim Crow. At the same time, history is repeating itself in so many ways when you examine the record. You hear people say all the time, this is the most important election, this is the most important election. I'll frame it in this regard. When you look at this time that we live in, it's the best of times, and it is the absolute worst of times. And it is only under a Barack Obama presidency that you could see the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that was reauthorized overwhelmingly during the Bush administration in 2006. Record complete, thousands upon thousands of pages. It is only under Barack Obama administration that you could see the kinds of insidious attacks against citizens, against minorities, against women. The assault goes on and on. But what it does, it sends a chilling message down the line so that you can have candidates like Michelle Nunn in Georgia, who's a Democrat candidate, who's saying, I'm not sure if the Voting Rights Act should apply to Georgia. Mm-hmm. It sends a chilling message down the line where you can have local elected officials, for example, in Augusta, Georgia, who have moved from and declared all of the municipality elections to be nonpartisan and are going to, and this is over objection of the Justice Department, where they say to us, sue us. They say to the NAACP, sue us. Well, we're answering that call and we're going to bring litigation against them. The good news is that in recent days, there has been some positive development in voting rights. For example, Frank versus Walker in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This was and we have to rise to this occasion. Our children will judge us harshly when we do so little with so much, when those who came before us took little and made so much out of it. So in Wisconsin, they have utilized Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to defend and successfully defend and overcome the state's voter ID laws. I think what we need to do is stop crying about the reality and start thinking, start strategizing, coming up with legal strategies within the framework of what exists to continue to advance our interests while we get the vote. But even with this, I talked to my colleague, Dr. Barber, and he tells me, and I agree with him, this bill is not salvation in and of itself. If it was adopted today, it would exclude Alabama and North Carolina. Mm-hmm. It would exclude North Carolina and Alabama from coverage? Are you serious? And then we think of it as if when there was a voting rights regime with a Section 4 that was in full force, as if that was a utopia. We still had to fight, even with a fully enforced Section 4. As a matter of fact, in Georgia, I was a named plaintiff on a case in District 12. District 12 is a district which has been reconfigured several times. The sole remaining Southern Democrat in the United States Congress, John Barrow, has been drawn out of his district 3 times. And each time they draw him out of his own district, the citizens come together in coalitions and elect the candidate of their choice. He happens to be white, but he is the candidate of the choice for that district, and they have tried to gerrymander him out 3 times. I was a named plaintiff because if they were trying to redraw him out of his district again, it reduces my ability to elect the candidate of my choice and others who are similarly situated. We have got to use every tool on the table. And in order for us to do that, we've got to get focused on the agenda. So, you all can continue to buy Barack Obama and Michelle Obama posters and figurines out of the mall parking lot, but the glory of that is over. The glory of that is over. We will wake up in a few months and we will realize that our legacy, that our birthright has been sold for a bowl of pottage. And that's not going to happen on the watch of those who are in this room.
Right on.
Thank you. So thank you for that, Francis. So I want to shift this conversation because you raised a very important point, Francis, and I want to encourage you, make sure you're live tweeting, #L500, get this conversation going. We will take questions over Twitter, so if you have questions and you're watching online, please tweet at #L500, just tweet your question out and we'll get your question in the queue. But you raised a good point in terms of the pipeline and how we need to strategize and think about voting rights very differently. I want to shift this to Duell and Albert. You spent a lot of time thinking about this. You in the U.S. Senate, you at LDF. What are some of the proposals? What should we think about? I know you travel across the world and look at other countries and what they're doing. What should the United States, or what should our voting rights, what should we be striving for? Like, what's the North Star in your opinion?
So part of the challenge is goes back to what Keisha spoke about a minute ago. There is a coordinated effort, and it's well funded, and it's very strategic to put all of the groups that we all support and work for that are on our side on defense. And when you're spending all this money and man hours, which are limited, fighting back, you don't have an opportunity to press forward and make additional progress. So let me make 2 points in that regard. The second point will be about what can be done, and the first point will be a little bit more about this sort of coordinated effort that's out there, because I think that if we paid more attention to that, and if we shared that with our friends and colleagues, we would be more enraged, and we would be more inspired to act, and we'd be more effective when we did so. We've all heard of the Koch brothers. There are, well, some of you have, some of you haven't. These two brothers are billionaires, and they have decided that they would pursue their political and financial interests through making tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of investments in a intricate, secret, connected web of organizations that would do everything from recruit candidates that would support right-wing conservative causes to put out entities that establish entities and fund entities that will do advertising, that do everything in between. They are intricately connected throughout the political world and throughout the country. And what these individuals have done is they've propped up think tanks, and they've propped up a media arm. They have infiltrated the entire American political democratic system in order to pursue their corporate conservative interests. And if you don't think that has an impact on people that look like you and I and the folks that we represent every day of the week, it absolutely does. On top of that, what you've had happen over the last several years is a Supreme Court that has struck down some of the key provisions in terms of campaign finance laws, voting rights laws, and a number of other things. You know, the bottom line is that now that we live in a space where the limits on what wealthy individuals, corporations, advocacy groups can spend on a campaign are completely gone, you don't have anybody calling for full disclosure anymore. It used to be that our friends on the right would say, listen, get rid of all these limits. Anybody should be able to spend as much as they want to spend to support a candidate or support a cause, and just make sure that the public knows who's behind it. Get rid of the limits, full disclosure. Well, now that we happen to have a conservative-leaning Supreme Court that got rid of all the limits, all of a sudden our friends on the right are no longer in favor of disclosure. And so what that means is you don't really know that the American People United for Apple Pie really is an organization that's trying to do everything they can to suppress the vote in all of our communities. And so when you think about the millions of dollars that have been spent in order to stop us from voting and stop the agenda and keep us on defense, it really should inspire and galvanize support among all of us in here and all of us that we're connected to in order to really get out there and engage in a way that's effective. How do we engage? What's effective? What do you mean? That gets to number 2 of my response. There are a number of efforts in Congress. We now, let me point them out. So there's the Voter Modernization Act, which is sponsored by Senator Gillibrand, that would do a wide range of things. If that bill were the law of the land today, a lot of this conversation we're having now would not even really be necessary, because you'd have a lot of online voter registration, you'd have same-day voting, you'd have a lot of standards for early voting, and all the things that would make voting more easier and accessible for people across the country. So we should be pushing for that. There's a Democracy Restoration Act, which is in Congress now, which would restore voting rights for those that have done their time, right, that have paid their debt to society and don't have any baggage of additional charges or that's what they should be able to go out and vote just like everyone else. So those are a couple of the specific things that we should be pushing for. But the truth is that the political reality is we have a divided Congress with Republicans in control of the House and Democrats in control of the Senate and a Democrat in the White House. And unfortunately, in this day and age, in the context that we're talking about, that leads to gridlock and not much getting done. And so that means that the real action, as much as we can push for legislation and as much as we're in the room negotiating, making compromises at times in order to try to get things through to make some progress instead of no progress at all, as much as we're doing that, we need you all to be in the streets, knocking on doors, raising money, going to the state houses, battling in court, and doing, it's a full out attack on not only the right to vote, but the American way.
Say so.
Right? And in order for us to respond to that attack, we've got to be organized, we've got to be engaged, and it's not just enough to talk and tweet about it, we got to do something about it.
That's right, thank you. Duell, did you want to get in there?
I just wanted to sort of emphasize the fact that the solutions are not necessarily in the courts. So I'm a lawyer, a lot of the work that I do is in the court, and a lot of what I'm trying to do is push back on things that have already been passed. But if folks can, one, the courts are more conservative than they've been in a long time. And so a part of what you can do in just pushing for and trying to get people who support the values that you support elected is keep in mind that these are also the people that put judges in office. They're also the people who make the laws that we support. And so if you can think about that in terms of remaining engaged and think about the fact that lawsuits are not always the solution, that's always important.
Can I add one quick thing?
Yes.
About local elections? I know it's a drum I'm not going to stop beating. Voting down the ticket, understanding who the judges are that are running for office, making sure that we're educated around, and I know that's a difficult thing. I know there's not a lot of information, particularly about judges, but Duell's point is incredibly important, that if we're not paying attention to who's in these seats, who's sitting on the bench, we're going to repeatedly run up, because again, that's the pipeline to get people into the federal bench, and that's really where a lot of these decisions are made that affect us nationally. So it are these state courts, again, where the elections occur. And I really have to emphasize voting down the ticket and poll worker training, becoming poll workers, volunteering on election day. Did I say that? Poll worker training, poll worker training, poll worker training. Being in the polls. One of the challenges around this is that it isn't just state offices that are training poll workers, right? We have organizations like True the Vote and others that are out there training people, getting them to believe that their job is to enforce and to be the barrier between this person and the polls and protect themselves and to quiz them on the information on their IDs and to do all these things, which is not their job. Their job is to facilitate elections, to make sure that everyone who comes to cast a vote, everyone who chooses to cast a legal and valid vote should be able to do so. And understanding that the people that are sitting there on the front lines are the last people to make that decision. And if you have to go back and fight, if we have to call Duell to try and make it work, if I have to get on the phone and run down, and having done election day challenges, there are hundreds of people that go home while I am running to the courthouse trying to get an injunction to stop behavior. The fact is, if we're there at the table, even if there's only one person leaning on another election judge saying, don't do that, give that person a ballot. No, their name's right here, it's just switched, it's spelled wrong, that's that person. Let them sign their name. And if we're not there, that is a challenge. Vote absentee and work on election day.
I think we're hearing some very important themes here. One, I'm hearing organize, that the power is with each of us in this room, that we can be poll workers, that we have to contact our members of Congress, we have to be proactive, because we cannot sit and depend on those that are elected into power to control our destiny, that we ultimately have to force that to happen. So I want to open this conversation up to the audience, and we want to get some questions from the audience. We want to encourage you. I know I have colleagues that are in the room that will have microphones, so if you have a question, if you can raise your hand, and if you can speak into the microphone, it's important for those that are watching us online. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. Okay, we're going to start with the gentleman in the back here, and then we're going to come up to this sister right here in the front. And if you could just say your name. Oh, that's Brother Eddie Hales. You can say your name. We know who you are from the Advancement Project.
All right.
Right on.
Thank you, Joe Taker, and the whole panel. Just a question, because the panel mentioned the the changing, shifting demographics in our nation, what are the opportunities and the strategies for multiracial collaborations, as Dr. Barber has shown in North Carolina?
I'll take that because the Georgia NAACP is engaged in that work right now. And there is a wonderful fusion politics that are developing on the ground, where we are understanding in ways that we haven't understood before that at the heart of moving America towards democracy is getting at the construct which is opposed to it. And in all of the isms that we're fighting with our partners in the social and civil rights movement, in all of those isms, there are a couple of things that are consistent. Racism, sexism, homophobism, xenophobism, all of the isms, there is a legal construct, okay? Behind that legal construct is a social maintenance, a political expediency, and economic benefits. And around these four ideas, Moral Monday is springing up in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Alabama, and Wisconsin, and Missouri, and other places around the country where we're locking arms. Why is this important? It's important because we have the conservative Supreme Court that we have because during the re-election of George Bush, politicians were able to socially, politically, economically, and legally put a wedge issue in the African American community where we should have been locked arms with our GBLTQ brothers. They were telling black pastors to discourage their congregations from voting. And we were silent about that. We were silent about that ism, homophobism. And as a result of that, George Bush was reelected and John Roberts was put on the Supreme Court and Sam Alito was put on the Supreme Court. And that is at the root of that. Until we understand that unless we're willing to pull for everyone who is oppressed and similarly situated, then this work cannot be done. We cannot advance our interests unless we're willing to advance the social interests of others. So that's the response, and it's happening, and I'm excited to be a part of it. Dr. Warnock is in the room probably somewhere. Dr. Warnock, stand up. Dr. Warnock is co-convening Moral Monday in Georgia. Me and Dr. Warnock went to jail on March the 18th together, singing "This Little Light of Mine, We're Gonna Let It Shine." And listen, it means something. This is what is at stake. We cannot, tweeting is fine, but you are gonna have to put some skin in the game.
Yes.
You're gonna have to put those degrees to work. You're gonna have to pull that Mercedes out of the garage. You're gonna have to take a Saturday off of the golf course and get your feet into the street. If your branch is not effective in the area, all you gotta do is get 10 or 15 people to go down to the meeting on election, turn the election over, and put a branch that can be effective. We cannot be asleep in this hour. Our children will ask us, how in the hell did we let so much get away while we slept at ease?
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have another question. Does any of our other panelists wanted to respond to that? There's a question here in the front. And if you have a question, if you're following us online, just tweet your question utilizing hashtag L500. Tweet your question L500.
Good morning, leadership family, and to our panelists. My name is Camelia Landrum. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. Oftentimes when we have this voting rights conversation, when I speak to my older colleagues, they're always saying, we boycotted, we picketed, we did sit-ins, and it's to cut the money off to these people that are fueling these aggressive campaigns in our communities. Do you all think as a people we could come together to pull something off like that in 2014, or are companies like Walmart, are they still unstoppable, or the Koch brothers? Do we have that financial force to come together and tear them off where they're fueling us?
I think it's possible. I think one of the challenges when we think about corporate boycotts today, it does have to be very targeted. I think we've seen effective changes. We've seen shaming of Target. We've seen Coca-Cola, we've seen McDonald's have to change their voice, pull their funding from places like ALEC, do other things because people have elevated the voice and say, we're not going to continue to spend money if you're going to support these sorts of efforts. The flip side of the coin is I was sent a list, I think it was Daily Kos posted a list of everything you'd have to boycott Koch brothers.
Including the toilet paper that you used in your room last night because they own Georgia Pacific.
They own Georgia Pacific, and so the problem is you don't even know where to boycott in order to boycott.
That's right.
A lot of it is manufacturing products. Like I can stay in the grocery store for an hour trying to figure it out.
I think we're good with the toilet tissue. I think we need to.
All right, so clearly, boycotting toilet tissue is off the table. So the challenge is, can boycotts work? Boycotts coupled, I believe, with specific targeted action has worked. Where you've seen corporations specifically donating money to particular efforts, supporting ballot initiatives, supporting candidates in their PACs that have policies that are antithetical to their customers. Those sorts of things have been effective, and we've seen corporations pull back, particularly in local areas, from that kind of work. I think we are in a struggle with multinationals and such large corporations to just unilaterally say, we're not going to support, Koch brothers. Can it work? I think it can in a targeted way, but it really has to be extremely targeted and know exactly what you're going for, as opposed to a general boycott, which may be less effective.
I think you should take boycotts to 2.0. So if your money is a political, and where you spend it is a political statement. So as long as we think it is okay that an NAACP membership is $35 and you're willing to pay to Sprint and T-Mobile and Virgin Mobile and everyone else $135 on average for your monthly cell phone bill, then boycotts are not the way to go. We have to reprioritize how we spend our money, period, regardless of what we boycott. And so I would say take it to the next level. In other words, get involved on your company roundtable where you all have those good jobs, like Mama said, in terms of where your company is spending its dollars, the contractors, the vendors. Press your interest at your church and go and talk to pastor. Maybe you are the pastor himself, and make sure that you are effectively spending resources towards people who support your best interest. Across the board, in every place of your sphere of influence, you should be pressing that our money is a priority and it is a political statement.
And that doing the right thing is good business.
That's right.
Let me make one point that I think is underlying this whole conversation, but should be said outright. As we think about what more can be done, what strategies can we engage in, that point is vote. There are votes. There are all these tools and strategies and efforts to stop us from doing that. And in a lot of circumstances, we're among family, so we can say it, a lot of circumstances, they don't really need to work that hard. Because so many of us are unregistered, so many of us would rather, do something else on election day or have a job that's so important, that's so busy that we can't step away and vote. Well, you've made their job that much easier. So they can direct those resources somewhere else. So we actually have to get out there and do the job of voting ourselves all the time. And we have to do the job of engaging our various communities to do the same. So as we think about broader strategies and coalitions and ways in which to make our money speak for us, we got to do the basic thing, and we got to do the basic thing all the time, and that's to actually vote and get our friends out there voting.
All the time.
Right.
Not just when it's sexy.
Right.
All the time.
Right.
Exactly. I think that's a good point.
It's all the time. As a practical matter, how many Koch brothers are there? Two. Right? Two. Give me 50 people and some clipboards. We can outvote them tomorrow.
Exactly.
Right? The point is that we talk a lot about the money in politics issue, which is real, which is incredibly important. And that's a struggle we really have to deal with, and probably a panel for a different day. But at the end of the day, how many people are actually showing up? And that is really a threshold issue. If we can get enough people to show up, then we've got the data to bring the lawsuits to say that the votes are being suppressed. We have a real challenge to bring a lawsuit to say, look, there's a representation problem, and they look at me as a turnout 25%. You have a showing up problem, right? So we have to be able to bring the lawsuits. A lot of this is data. A lot of this,
yes, exactly.
A lot of the issues cannot necessarily be resolved, right? around these issues, particularly talking about representation and redistricting, but we can bring the fight a lot harder if people are turning out.
Absolutely. I think this boils down to organized people will always beat out organized money. And so we just
That's right.
really have to make sure that we are
Tweet
organized
that.
people.
That was good.
Organized people will always beat out organized money. Our next question.
Okay, great. How you doing? Thank you all. Really getting a lot out of this. My name is Gerald Stansbury. I'm from the Maryland State Conference, NAACP president there. A lot of what you're talking about, I am so proud to see that we in Maryland are doing those things. We have the same-day registration. We have the early voting. We have 2 lobbyists in Annapolis every legislative session. 2. Okay, we have a political action chair on the job constantly. We are in so much demand in Maryland that whenever any legislation come out, people are looking to make sure that the NAACP is okay with that legislation before they put it on the table. It takes integrity, number 1. It takes teamwork, number 2, collaboration, just like you said. I'm telling you, we're moving to a point now, we just got a law passed that we actually was responsible for having written. We got the right people to write the language into the law.
That's right.
It was a voter rights protection law. Now, we're not subjected to Section 5 in Maryland. However, now every local county in Maryland, the local state's attorney has the obligation to prosecute any misconduct in regards to voter rights. They can't move the voting poll. We don't have the pre-clearance, but they cannot move it. If the Maryland State NAACP or anybody else complain about that, there are locals, and that law had not been changed since 1890. When we brought that to the attention of our Attorney General, he said, okay, fine. We said, we want the language. He said, okay, fine. We got the language, we got the bill passed. So I'm saying let's not just be there to oppose a bill. Let's not just be there to support a bill. Let's start making the law. We need to start making the law to protect our own people. And I hope more and more that we will do that. One question I got to ask you, is there anyone with the Voter Rights Act that's working on the Voter Rights Act helping to get judges in position? We need to make sure that we start strategizing, stop playing checkers, okay, and start playing chess.
That's
okay,
right.
and make sure we are. I have to proudly say one last point is that in Maryland, in Dorchester County, we got our first African-American judge. I just got the call yesterday as a result, not totally, but as a result of the NAACP having influence by writing and talking to the right people saying, we want this man, he's a great judge, we want him in position. Thank you very much.
That's a
Albert,
great
do
point.
you want to respond to that question?
That's a great point, and let me commend you all on what you're doing in Maryland, and that's great progress, and it's a great example for the country. How do you replicate that throughout the country? How do we support organizations that are advancing this cause and that are doing what's necessary so that we're not just playing defense, so that we have an active, affirmative agenda and we're pushing the ball down the field? Number 1, we can't just talk about it. We can't just tweet about it. We have to take our wallets out, put our credit card numbers in, and support our organizations financially.
That's right.
That's right.
I'm gonna say it again.
Clap for that.
Don't worry, I'm not gonna bring up Malachi chapter 3 and talk about tithing, but I'm not gonna do that. But the point is that in order for us to be effective in our community, we need to financially support more than just our churches. Our churches are incredibly important.
Say so.
But we have to support more than just our churches. We have to support the NAACP. We need to support partner organizations that are out there fighting this fight, because guess what? If they don't have the money, the lawsuits are not being brought, and then we'll be very upset about X, Y, and Z and complaining. But no, if they don't have the resources to fight the likes of the Kochs and others, we're fighting a lost cause here. Now, I'm all about supporting financially. It's important. It's incredibly important. But where my money goes, so does my attention. And so does my focus, and so does my advocacy. That means if I give the NAACP my money, I'm going to be watching to see and I'm going to hold them accountable for the ways in which they're using that money and the ways in which they're spending that money to advocate for our interests. So yes, support financially, and then make sure the organizations that you're supporting are out there pushing the agenda for change, focused not just on fighting laws, but also focused on promoting and talking about judges, because it's all about, Keisha, you made the point earlier, it's all about the pipeline. We have to be looking at the broader picture. And the thing about it is, unlike games on your computer or whatever, there are multiple things happening all the time in this space. There's voting, there's the campaign finance, there's the workers' issues, there's labor issues. There are a number of issues happening all at the same time, so we have to be engaged. So the lobbyists for the NAACP and other organizations that need to be at the state level, they need resources in order to do that. The lawyers that are going to be in the courtroom, not going down to Wall Street and cashing a big check, they need to have resources in order to support them in the courtroom to fight these battles.
That's right.
We need to have the money to pay the bail. We need those resources there. So we have to support our organizations with our dollars and not just our mouths, but we also have to keep them and hold them accountable so they know that we're watching, we're listening, and we want them to do the right thing.
Thank you. So we have a question online. So I want to go to this question online, and Tanza, I think Tanza is in here. Tanza, you skipped line. You went on the, hey, I'm not mad at you. So Tanza has a question, and her question is, how do we fix felony disenfranchisement? How do we fix felony disenfranchisement? Thank you for that question.
You fix it by acknowledging why it exists in the first place. I shared this on the panel yesterday. Historically, there were only around 7 felonies, period. And none of them disenfranchised you from the right to vote. None of them did. I mean, we've had vice presidents of the United States duel in the street and kill other citizens, and it didn't stop them from having the right to vote. It is only after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do you see, first of all, a rise in organized police forces across the state, and you also see a rise in a connection between felonies and the number of felonies, and each year General Assemblies are passing new felonies, and a connection to that and the loss of the right to vote. And I think that is a unique problem that is American and is part of the insidious nature of American racism. So acknowledging that and decoupling that in your own mind, that somehow because you do X, you should lose the right to vote, it makes no sense at all. Other countries around the world don't do it, and neither should we.
All these things are interconnected.
Yeah,
Yes.
But to talk specifically to felon disenfranchisement, there's a couple things that can happen. One, there's legislation in some states. In Kentucky, we've got a constitutional amendment pending that looks like it may move. There's a lot of allegiances among the faith community in particular on this issue. We've seen effective ways of using executive power, even where a governor doesn't necessarily have a legislature. We saw it. The downside to using executive power can be switched with the next governor, but we certainly have seen it work in Florida, Iowa, and other places where the governor's been able to go in and sort of circumvent the process or streamline the process for people where there are states that need specific approval to get someone back in the process. We can start eliminating some of the laws that make it extremely difficult around paying fees and fines associated with convictions that must be cleared before you can vote again. And so there's different stages, but I would say first, legislative action is the first way to go if you have a friendly legislature, and really finding champions there and finding allies in the community. Second, I would say executive power, executive orders, leaning on individuals who have the strength to do that work and do it if you have the action. If you have an initiative in referendum state, actually being able to move a constitutional amendment that requires a huge financial investment, but it is another way to move these laws. But those are the 3 fastest ways I can think of to resolve that issue.
And I just want to say quickly, that's also a lesson in learning about making coalitions where you don't think they might exist. In Kentucky, Rand Paul is one of the people who's pushing for felon disenfranchisement laws to be changed so that more people can vote. And he talks about the fact that African Americans are disproportionately affected by that. So you need to look at people who are Republicans, who are sort of outside of the usual suspects, who might be able to help you.
It's a great point. Two quick things. Number one, I do want to applaud Senator Paul for his work on this issue. We need Republican partners, and he should be commended for coming out and speaking about this felon disenfranchisement issue. And if he's going to be a champion for voting rights, he should stand up also and be a champion to help us fix the Voting Rights Act, right? Because a part of this thing is critical, and we need to do that. The point that you made about the felon disenfranchisement piece, there is no federal law that says felons cannot vote, right? There is no federal law, so the action is at the state level, and it is all impacted because it's all connected. And so we need folks to get out and vote and elect the right people in the state legislatures, get the right person in the state house, and do all the things that Keisha talked about.
Sorry, one last thing. Voter education. There's a lot of people who can vote who think they can't.
That's right.
Right? To me, that's a lot of baseline stuff. And I know when I was doing a lot more organizing in the streets, you go to people and say, oh, I can't vote. It's like, are you off paper? Yes, then you can vote. They just don't think they can. So that's another piece, is that there's a lot of misinformation
in
around
some states.
rights.
Some states have automatic restoration of your full citizenship rights once you complete your term of probation, parole, and supervision in the criminal justice system. In other states, you have to petition for them to be restored. And so this is meaningful work that the Criminal Justice Committee of your local NAACP can help put together, a workshop on how to petition for the restoration of your rights to vote. What a wonderful workshop. I think we'll see that on the calendars in some of the communities.
And for those of y'all who are online and you're in the audience, if you have questions about this, the NAACP has a very expansive programmatic work in this area. You can go to www.restorethevotes.org and you can get information, the education, and more information about the work that we're doing. And I would note that we did change the Constitution in Delaware to re-enfranchise about 29,000 voters.
Wonderful.
So we have time for 2 more questions, and then we have 3 more very quickly. Our panelists will be rapid fire on the response, and we have 1 question in the queue that's online. So we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Erica Taylor, and I have 2 questions. They're really quick, though, that I want to ask. One, you've mentioned a lot about pipelining, and wanted to see if you could speak to the fact that it doesn't just happen in courts, as you already said, but there are other regulatory agencies that could help push agendas along. So as long as we're pipelining our young people into the government and all of its branches, they can be helpful, especially for things like voting rights and for the ACA and the issues that impact communities of color. The second thing, what are your strategies to help fight against distraction? So we get people all mobilized and fired up when you hear something about Mike Cuban, and it's a distraction. It takes us away from the real issues at hand about racism and how it functions in this country. So how do you get us back to center, or how do we work with people to get them back to center about the issues that are truly important?
Well, I'll jump in. You're right. The pipeline is extremely, extremely important. Once legislation is passed, right, it's left to the agencies at the federal level, and it's left to the agencies to do the implementation. So what do those regulations look like? What does it mean to enact a particular version of a statute? So we need young people to be engaged and involved and to commit to doing public service. Part of the reason why some of our friends on the other side of the aisle bash government so much and talk so bad about inefficiency and waste and all these other things is to demoralize people about public service. So it is not necessarily an attractive and laudable goal. One of the great things about having this particular president in office is that he has inspired a generation of people to work for the public good and to be engaged in public service. Well, in response to that, there are people that are willing to spend millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to try to get folks to not do that thing, to not have any faith in government, to think government is a big bad guy in the room always messing stuff up. Well, actually, that's not the case. And we can make government be effective, we can make government be better, we make government responsive to our communities if we do that. You raised the second point, it slipped my mind. Oh, distractions.
Don't believe the hype.
I was distracted by your point about distractions. Listen, I am happy that people called out Donald Sterling and people are focused on the racist things that people say, but I'd much rather us focus on things that we've talked about today. Because at the end of the day, Donald Sterling is not standing in front of the ballot box trying to prevent you from voting and expressing the will of the people in a democratic process.
Say it again.
And on a related point, even if he has to sell the team, he's going to sell the team at a $950 million profit. So what kind of punishment
And
is
even
that?
the fine is tax.
And even the fine, wow, I didn't realize that. Anyway, the distraction, right? But the point, the point is that we have to be thoughtful and vigilant and tuned into media sources that have a reputation for being thoughtful and truthful and raising issues that aren't always heard on our friends at Fox News.
And it's got to be part of our communication strategies, that when we have these issues, we have these points, leverage these points of interest around the country, but keep bringing it back. But all these points have to be integrated into the communication strategies, and not just, oh, we have a voting strategy over here, we have this over here. Every chapter has some level of communication strategy and how you communicate with leadership and everything else. So I think there really is, there's a piece there that's simply about how is it part of the communication strategy, how do we keep bringing attention back to it, and I think it just has to be part of the integrated work that's done.
Now, Dr. Warner, you've been so patient. You've been so patient back there. We're going to go to you.
I am patient. The Voting Rights Act of, is it 213, 214?
2014.
214. To what degree should we be advocating and pushing for the passage of Voting Rights Act of 214, and to what degree, given the real politics on the ground, should we be pushing back or at least arguing that it doesn't go far enough? The bar is very high to prove discrimination, and right now there are only 4 states, last iteration I saw, included in this renewal of the Voting Rights Act. I'm glad that my beloved state of Georgia is in that. I don't understand how Alabama's not there, for example. So and yet you've got the real politics on the ground, and we need to get something passed. So to what degree do we advocate for this? To what degree do we push back and say this is not enough? How are we going to figure that out, given the implications? And where exactly are we in the process?
Very good question. And I believe that the answer is to push for the passage of this bill. Is it the perfect bill? Does it do everything that we would want it to do? No. But let me also be frank and say that if we had a bill that was the perfect bill, that we all agreed on, and that would do and cover all the states we think should be covered, it would have no chance of going anywhere right now. And so when you look at the real life political realm that we live in, with a divided Congress and a country that doesn't even understand, in some cases, why we need to have this particular approach, the bottom line is that we've crafted a legislative vehicle that can move, that has the support of some Republicans and some Democrats, and we need to push it forward. I am much more in favor of pushing this bill through and getting it done now, so that we can make improvements on it over time, rather than allowing the status quo to remain in place, because that means that organizations like the ones here represented are basically on the defensive, and they are having to spend millions of dollars and responding, as opposed to having some federal vehicle in there that can provide the oversight and hold these entities accountable. Is it perfect? It's not perfect, right? But we can fix it, and we need to get it done. In terms of current status, we look to have an initial hearing on the bill on the Senate Judiciary Committee in the next several weeks. And from there, the process will be for markup, where the bill is debated and amendments are added or taken from it, and then hopefully a full vote on the floor of the Senate. But right now, we're pushing for a Republican co-sponsor, which would help push this process forward. Like I said, it's already bipartisan on the House side.
Right, but we're also trying to get a hearing in the House, yeah? Yeah, I mean, one of the issues right now is really pushing just to get it heard. Let's get a hearing to talk about what the provisions should or could be, or whether or not once against a conference, then we'll talk about that. Right now, it needs a hearing in the House.
Yeah, so all of you all on Twitter, you need to find Chairman Goodlatte, who is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. Tweet him, I think it's Rep Goodlatte. tweet him that we need a hearing in the House on the VRAA. That's very important. We have a question in the back.
Yeah, I'm Pia Alexander Harris from New York. One of the things that I think we definitely need to do is make sure that the C is something that stays engaged in the NAACP. We have to make sure that all communities of color are understanding that they are impacted by these voting restrictions, and it's just an all-out war, actually. I know in New York in particular, what we talked about with communities of color, Latinos are being pushed towards the Republican and towards the right-wing interests, and we're not able to embrace them enough in New York. So I know that's something that we need to do. But I wanted to ask about the pre-registration of 16 to 17-year-olds that you discussed in terms of something that we're pushing or wanting to push. How can we right now, as communities, get engaged and try and become part of a movement or a mobilization to make that happen? I mean, these 16 and 17-year-olds, they should be pre-registered. But then also anyone in a predominantly black college or university or an HBCU should either be registered or pre-registered. And unfortunately, so many alumni that I know are not with the NAACP. They're not members, and they're not registered to vote. It's unbelievable.
Okay, so we're going to separate college and 16, 17-year-olds. So first of all, when we're talking public colleges and universities, many of them are already obligated to registered voters and are not doing it, right? So let's start there. A lot of these in states are NVRA agencies. They're supposed to be registering students as they begin and enter the process. They're not being done. So a lot of the challenges we talk about pushing people in the pipeline to change the laws, we got to make sure what we have is already being enforced. So we've got NVRA rules around certainly public colleges and universities. Private colleges and universities, that is simply a question of, to the extent they're alumni and others that can push hard, their campus organizations, campus activities, and I know there are probably others in this room that are probably more closely tapped into a lot of campus work that's being done than I. As we talk about 16 and 17-year-olds being able to vote, this can be done at different levels in terms of what levels are able to accept the registrations. The problem is if the state isn't willing to accept the registrations, you end up with registrations sitting in a box until they can actually be shipped over and someone turns 18 and they can go into the system. So that is primarily a legislative function at the state level to get 16 and 17-year-olds pre-registered and into the system.
It's also something that's under attack as well. North Carolina is a perfect example. For years, students in North Carolina when they were seniors or juniors in high school, they were able to pre-register so that by the time they were 18, they were already registered and able to go to the ballot box and cast a ballot. Well, North Carolina has what Hillary Clinton calls the greatest hits of voter suppression in its new law, and it cut that out. And if you don't think the votes of young people are under attack, and if you don't think there are forces out there that don't want all of you to go and vote, all you have to do is look at what they did in Texas. Texas, they said, listen, we want people to show photo ID in order to vote. What kind of photo ID? The devil's always in the details, right? What kind of photo ID would work? If you have a state issue concealed carry license for your guns, that's a good ID. You can use that. You can go
But
ahead
I
and
have
vote.
my ID from the state of Texas, from Texas University. Can I use that?
No, that's no good. Right. So the point is,
We have role play.
the point is, the
They
youth
did
vote.
not plan that.
It was spontaneous, and you're a wonderful co-star. The point is, the youth vote is under attack, and so be mindful of that, and we should be pushing for registration.
So our last question, and it's going to come from online, and it comes from Activist Ammo. And it says, and we're going to go very quickly, and then we're going to wrap up. It says, do you see a need to train young people to become elected officials for our community? Now we know the answer to that question. What do you guys think the answer to that question is? But we're going to let our panelists very quickly, because we have to wrap up, sort of duel.
Going off that, in Waller County, Texas, which we sort of talking about a little bit now, LDF is representing students who cannot vote under the current voter ID law because they only have student ID, and they've used student ID to vote in the past. And this is part of a long history in Texas of attacking students at Prairie View University, which is a historically black university in that county, in which students have been elected to public office, students have remained engaged. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the fact that young people should be engaged in the communities that they are living in, whether it's in college or in your hometown, and making sure that the people who you respect and that your right to votes are protected.
Anyone want to respond to that question additionally, Francis?
I'll respond it's a great question. Unless elected officials are going to change the game, it really doesn't matter who you put in office. You're going to still get the same outcomes. So elected officials have got to go with an agenda of change, period. In Quitman, Georgia, there were some courageous individuals who said, we are going to get engaged and we're going to change education in Quitman, Georgia. Last at the bottom of the pile of a state that's at the bottom of the pile. And one principal, Dr. Denard, and I give her credit for this, came up with a strategy of using absentee ballots, because you can get an absentee ballot in Georgia for no reason at all except the fact that you want one. She passed them out to all of the elderly, everybody at church, all the young people who could vote, and they had a campaign, a coordinated effort. They were able to elect a new majority to the Board of Education in Brooks County. And what happened was the folks in power, because this is, somebody say racism is power. It's about power. And so when the power dynamic was shifting there, they were under attack, and they're still under attack. So the U.S. postal workers began commandeering the absentee ballots, writing lists of where they were being mailed from in violation of federal law and state law. The local election supervisor took the absentee ballots home and allowed her grandchildren to count them, spoiled several of them. Some of them were just discarded altogether, violation of federal, state laws as well. The candidates were allowed who didn't win in primaries to be write-in candidates against state law, prohibiting sour grape candidates. On the general election, the candidates, and Sister Denard is the secretary of the NAACP in Brooks County. She beat the power folks, the selected candidates from that community in the primary, in the general election, and then won re-election again. In the meantime, they have indicted her for voter fraud through our Republican Secretary of State. We're not nonpartisan, but we're certainly political. And we see exactly what it is, using GBI investigators to raid their homes. The case came to trial. It was declared a mistrial without any defense evidence. The state bungled their own case. Things came out that were extraordinary that they had done, including the fact that the local school board attorney, whose real client was Ms. Denard, hired a private investigator to follow her and totally violated his oath of office as an attorney to her. You don't know anything about Quitman 10, do you? And you won't, because there's only been one story written about it. You will know more about Quitman 10 in about 2 weeks, because we have a presser. We have Salon and New York Times. Several folks are coming to Quitman. They're going to spend 3 days, and this is going to be news. When you hear about it, I want you to know that it is not an isolated incident. If you put folks up to run for office, this is what they face in many of the counties and many of the places that they will hold those offices. When you hear about Quitman, echo it around the country, because there are Quitmans everywhere. So I'm all right for letting candidates stand up. But when they stand up, we've got to be ready to defend their interest.
Thank you. So we want to thank our panelists. As we close this conversation, I want to give each of our panelists 20 seconds to leave us with a charge, with something that they want us to remember. We're going to start with Keisha. 20 seconds.
I go to a lot of these meetings around the country, not NAA, but lots and lots of meetings around the country. And I have to say that this meeting started with something I rarely hear, which is about power. That the strategy that I saw up in the early PowerPoint is a really strong strategy. NAA has come forth with a very strong message around value, has come forth with a very strong strategy. And to the extent this can be followed and really be worked, I believe, looking around the country all the time at the various strategies that are being put forth everywhere, this is one of the most coherent and clear strategies I have seen for retaining and regaining power around the ballot.
Thank you.
All of our isms that we're fighting for across the social civil rights agenda, all legally constructed, they're all socially maintained, they're all politically expedient for someone to exploit, and they all have economic benefits. When you can cut those things off, then we'll rid ourselves of all of the isms. Absolutely.
So 50 years after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, we are the generation that elected the first African American president. We are the generation that has engaged in incredible progress. The question is, do we want to drop the ball and be the generation that's responsible for seeing backward steps on Dr. King's dream and all that those that came before us fought for? If not, if we don't want to be remembered as that generation, we can't just talk. We have to act. Because, as Frederick Douglass reminded us, power does not concede. It does not concede anything without a struggle. Let's struggle.
All right, Brother Albert. Albert's going to get a church.
I would just say
Brother Jim.
amplify and organize. Amplify your voice. Let the NAACP, your local NAACP, the national NAACP, know what's going on in your community, be active in your community, and organize. Organize around national issues like the Voting Rights Act amendments. Someone had a question about whether or not Alabama is covered. Well, Alabama is only covered when people let us know that Alabama is messing up in some way. And Alabama is bound to mess up. It's messed up for 100, 200 years. It's going to mess up again. So just keep all that in mind. Keep organizing.
Can't
Keep
stop, won't
amplifying
stop.
your voice.
So we want to thank you all for this panel. We also want to thank and recognize our sponsors who actually helped make this happen. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation for their great support for all of this work. Let's thank them. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. They're all amazing. Make sure you follow them on Twitter. And we want to really close out. If everybody could just stand up. We're going to take this back to where we started. Take it back. Look at your neighbor. Say, neighbor.
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 What's happening?
What's happening
Is an attempt.
is an attempt
To shift.
to shift
Political. Power.
power.
Neighbor.
Neighbor.
What's happening?
What's happening
Is an attempt.
is an attempt
To shift.
to shift
Political. Power.
Power.
It's up to you.
It's up to you.
It's up to me.
It's up to me
To stop it.
to stop it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.